Bill Good. For decades, Bill influenced public policy in British Columbia from his seat behind the microphone at CKNW. No topic was too controversial or complicated as long as his audience was interested. And his audience included politicians of every stripe who knew they had better pay attention to the day's leading stories because, for sure, they would be asked to comment. Bill Good's journey from star sports broadcaster to leading television news anchor to talk radio host is in many ways the story of broadcasting in British Columbia. We sat down in his lovely home on the Sunshine Coast to reminisce. Bill, growing up with such a famous and respected father in sports broadcasting, that had to be an influence in your life.
I had a father who loved his work. And I watched him for all the years I was growing up. And my mother used to tell a story that I walked around the house talking into a spoon when I was 4 years old, as if it was a microphone. And so I always knew what I wanted to do. But interestingly enough, I was not going to do sports because I didn't want to be seen following in my father's footsteps. And that's why I tell young journalists, don't make too many decisions early, because I wound up at CBC in Vancouver on the general announce staff. The Vancouver Canucks came into the NHL. They insisted that I audition for a spot on Hockey Night in Canada, and I got the job, and I spent 10 years doing Hockey Night in Canada, doing sports, doing the Olympics in Sapporo and in Montreal, and had an absolutely fabulous 10-year career in sports, which I never intended to do.
I think you said once that it was probably the best time in your career.
Well, think about it. I mean, and I was 27 years old, I think, when I went to Russia and to Moscow to do the 72 Summit Series, and went to Japan and Sapporo to do the Olympics. And after I did the 72 Series in Moscow, Hockey Night in Canada tried to persuade me to go to Toronto to work with them in Toronto. And I spent 2 or 3 months negotiating, but not wanting to go. And I finally just said, no, I'm not going. I'm staying here in Vancouver with CBC. And Gordon Craig, who was then in charge of sports for CBC, said, we're really glad you made that decision. Now, would you like to go to Japan and do the Olympics? As I guess a kind of a reward for staying with the corporation at the time. And so life just kind of went on from there. And then Gordy Craig came out to Vancouver to run CBC Vancouver, and he wanted me to switch from sports to news. And I'd always really been a news junkie, and if I'd had my way 10 years before, I'd have probably gone into news to start. So I wound up anchoring the CBC News for, I think, 10 years.
I'm curious about your experience of going from sports to news, because I know when I went from daily television to public affairs, there was a stereotype, right?
Yep.
And so they wanted me to do the recipes, but I wanted to do the Prime Minister.
Yes.
And yet, did you find going from sports to news that they were a little skeptical that you really knew stuff?
Yes, but you know what changed was almost immediately there was an election, I think it was 1979. And I worked my tail off. I talked to somebody in every riding that could possibly be significant in the election. And I did the election broadcast and got really good reviews. And from that point on, nobody doubted that I knew my stuff, that I did my homework, and that I belonged in news. So that was a turning point for me. I'd always been really interested in news. I had an interest in sports because of my dad. But I watched news constantly. I read newspapers constantly. I was a news junkie who happened to be working in sports. So when I got the opportunity to work in news, it was a very natural transition for me. I remember, getting ready to do that election. I talked to almost every riding in the province. I've got a really good short-term memory. I can remember almost everything that anybody says to me until I don't need it anymore. So once the election's over, everything is sort of gone from my memory. But I can recite virtually everything for a month or two that anybody tells me.
And so in doing that, did you feel that there was a highlight in your news career at that point, early point?
The election was a highlight. And then I did a convention in Whistler Denny Boyd wrote about raving about my bladder because I did 9 hours straight without a commercial break. And again, I'd done a lot of homework and basically ad-libbed for 9 hours. And again, that sort of told people that, yeah, he knows his stuff, and that there was never any more doubt in terms of whether or not I belonged in news.
How do you do that? Talk for 9 hours?
I think that's where the sports background really helped. You work without, I mean, you have notes, but you don't have scripts. I guess I was born with the gift of the gab, as they say, and I could just talk. What else could you do? You had to. The camera was rolling. There were no commercials. You had guests and you had analysts and stuff, people to talk with. But no, I loved every minute. I loved doing live radio and live television. To me, an election or a convention was the equivalent of the Olympics.
So when you're doing live, I know in those early days of local television especially, there was a lot of shenanigans going on in the studio.
Oh, yeah.
And I certainly had people trying to break me up while I was on camera. Did you?
I had a producer named Ron Harrison who crawled under the set one day and started pulling my socks down while I was reading this. I was doing the sports at the time, and he pulls my socks down. Well, that didn't break me up, so then he put his hands in my pockets. And that kind of got to me. So I said, "Excuse me, would you please leave?" And you heard this foot, as he crawled out to go out the back door of the old CBC building. Yeah, there was a lot of that stuff. I mean, there's nothing like that happens anymore, I don't think. But back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of stuff like that.
And live is exhilarating, isn't it?
I loved live radio and television. It just, that was sort of my lifeblood was.
And so you moved as well to radio. When I first came to Vancouver, I could not believe the power of talk radio at that time.
Yeah.
I didn't see anything like that in Ontario.
Well, there isn't. There wasn't anything like NW anywhere in Canada and really in the States. CKNW is a jewel of a radio station. One of the reasons I left CBC to go to CKNW is that it was locally owned. Frank Griffiths owned it, and it just commanded the market. I mean, a prime minister wouldn't come to town and not come on your radio show. It was expected, and they dare not do it. Whereas they didn't do it in most other cities. I don't think they did it even in Toronto. I remember Joe Clark was on my show one day, and he talked to me later. He says, "Does everybody in Vancouver listen to you?" I said, "Well, I'd like to think so. Why?" He said, "Well, I went to Park Royal after I was on your show, and everywhere I went, people stopped and said, 'I just heard you with Bill Good.'" And that kind of stuff happened all the time,
So why do you think? Why do you think talk radio here was such a success?
Do you remember Jack Webster?
You do.
Well, Jack was a unique performer. I mean, journalist. He was an entertainer. He was a journalist. He was fabulous talent, and he built talk radio in Vancouver, in my mind. Pat Burns was also a big deal at the time. I think we're talking the late 60s. Talk radio in those days, and I think until fairly recently, was something that you felt you had to listen to know what was going on. And Jack created that. Bannerman did it. Rafe did it. People, I used to get stopped by people who say, "Damn you." I'd say, "What?" I said, "I was in my car, and I was on my way to go to work, and I couldn't get out of the car. I had to keep listening to you until you finished what you were doing." And I'd go, "Thank you." That was the whole idea, right? Get the audience, hold the audience. And NW, it was a format unlike anything else in the world. They had Brian Frosty Forrest in the morning, who is a brilliant comic genius. Then Webster, and then throughout the time, and then Rafe came along, and they didn't have a format. Nobody would remember. Bill Hughes used to go on the bus every morning and talk to people. He'd say, "Well, what consultant from Chicago would come and say you should put some guy on a bus to talk to tourists?" Well, Bill had traveled the world. He talked to tourists because he'd been to everywhere in South America, in Great Britain, in Russia, whatever. So it was compelling radio. And that was what made NW unique. I remember Ted Smith, who ran the station for years, said, "We hire thoroughbreds and we let them run." And I thought that was brilliant. But it didn't matter whether you were, I mean, Frosty was a disc jockey, so-called, but then you had talk, and then you had Rick Honey in the afternoon, and then eventually you had Philip Till and John McComb. There wasn't a book that said you could do this, and people who eventually wound up owning radio stations across the country wanted a cookie cutter formula. They wanted the Toronto station to seem like the Winnipeg station, to sound like the Vancouver station. Well, every city doesn't have the same talent. And so, NW just assembled unique talents and put them in for 2 or 3 hours at a time. And it didn't matter whether, I mean, you couldn't get two people less alike than Rafe Mayer and Bill Good, right? But people listened to Rafe and then they listened to me. They didn't care that we were totally different. They just liked what we did. And that was what made the station unique.
With all those big names that you've mentioned, Webster, perhaps at the front of the line.
Absolutely the front of the line. There was nobody ever like him and never will be.
Did you feel intimidated? Did you feel you had to copy them or
No.
do what they were doing?
You couldn't copy them. If you tried to copy Jack, I mean, you'd be a total failure. You couldn't copy Jack. I was honored that Jack actually became a fan of mine. And I'll never forget that he came in my studio one day and says, "Do you mind if I smoke?" I said, "No, you can't smoke in here." And then I went, "I just told Jack Webster he couldn't smoke in my studio." It was like, oh. No, I always looked up to him. I looked up to a lot of people, but I never tried to copy anybody. I think you have to be yourself.
Did you work at cultivating who this Bill Good persona would be?
No.
Other than talking to a spoon?
No. I just did. I just tried to be myself, and miraculously it worked. But I never tried to copy anybody. I tried to. One of the things I learned from my father was do your homework. And the other thing he said was, if you're interviewing somebody, listen to them and hear what they're saying. Don't have a list of questions that you're determined to follow. I mean, have a conversation and respond to what they're saying. And if they tell you that, 30 years ago they were an axe murderer, you better follow up on that instead of going to the next question you were gonna, you'd written down. But apart from that, no, I just tried to be myself. I did it for 57 years, so it must have worked, but I never did understand why.
Well, to a great extent, because you are such a fine interviewer, and interviewing is an art. Does somebody stand out in your mind of all the people you interviewed?
Well, Jack did. Ted Koppel did. Ted Koppel, who did Nightline for years on ABC, because he was just so knowledgeable. And he could ask really hard questions, but he was never rude or obnoxious. But Peter Jennings, I admired a great deal. Mansbridge, I did. I thought Peter Mansbridge was a terrific talent, self-taught primarily, but also always well-researched. Always, had prepared really, really well.
Did you ever interview Trudeau?
Yes.
Pierre Trudeau.
Yes, both of them actually. I interviewed virtually every prime minister from Pierre Trudeau through to Stephen Harper, and I interviewed Justin Trudeau before he became prime minister. I'll tell you a funny story. Pierre Trudeau I interviewed, I think it was the day after he had signed the Constitution, or the Charter. And I did it in the Bayshore lobby, and I was surrounded by all the national reporters and whatnot. I think I was like 35 years old. So he's a pretty intimidating character, right? So I did this interview, and everybody said I did okay. So then he died years later, and I was listening to CBC radio in the car, and they said, we're going to play an interview that Bill Good did with Pierre Trudeau. And I went, oh, geez. He's dead, and he still intimidates me. Because I had to listen to this interview, and I listened to it, and I did okay. But I thought it was really funny that I was really apprehensive about hearing this interview that I hadn't heard for 30 years because, he was Pierre Trudeau. And he, unlike most politicians, he didn't care if you liked him. He tested you. He wanted to make sure you were listening. He wanted to make sure you were paying attention. And he really just didn't give a damn whether or not, you liked him. I interviewed Joe Clark, whom I really liked later in life. But he was more like the president of the Chamber of Commerce, he wanted to be liked. Trudeau didn't, he just didn't care. He was just himself, and he was tough.
And no tolerance for reporters who didn't do their homework.
Apparently not.
As we've seen evidence from time to time
Yes.
in his history.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's why he was intimidated. I think he's probably the only person on the planet who intimidated Webster. Webster stayed awake at night before he interviewed Trudeau.
When you look at your career, radio, television, often overlapping, what's the difference for you as a presenter, as an
Interesting.
interviewer?
I hated that term presenter because it implies you're doing somebody else's work, which in television you often are. I've said in television, if you're anchoring in television, you're the cover of the page or of the magazine for 70 other people's work. When you're doing radio, especially talk radio, it's you. I was blessed with good producers and they gave me good stuff. But in the end, it's all on you. That's the big difference. And that's why I loved doing talk radio, because you basically, it was all on you, and you had to perform, and you had to have the goods every day, no pun intended.
The other comparison, I would think, is the relationship with an audience, because in a television studio and you're doing the news, whatever, but radio, like you hear like this, if people are with you or against you.
Oh yeah, but that's what I liked about it. You know what I loved about radio is I do an editorial every morning. Gladys Johnson was a great producer of mine, and I was so honored because she came out of retirement from having worked with Jack to work with me. And I used to come in the morning at NW, I'd say, "So Gladys, what should I feel strongly about today?" And then I'd write an editorial, and that's the way I see it. And I'd open the phones to see what people had to say, whether they agreed, disagreed. But I always thought talk radio was kind of like a lightning rod. I remember when the Reform Party started to become a big deal in the West. It became a big deal on radio well before it became a big deal in polls and before anybody got elected. But you knew from listening to the callers on talk radio that the Reform Party was something to pay attention to, that it was going to happen, and it did.
It is exactly my experience on the political side, that politicians had to listen to your show in the morning because they knew that during the day other news people would be asking them those questions. It was just a duty.
So I've heard.
And it's true.
Yeah, well, it was, and I can't think of anything more flattering. But I think that people had a trust in me. I had politicians after I'd left saying, when I came on your show, I was always concerned about what you were going to ask me, but I always knew I was going to get treated fairly. And I always wanted to know, it wasn't about me, I was always wanting to know where they were coming from, what they were about, and trying to get it out of them. And I tried not to let them sort of BS me or the audience. So I tried to hold them to account, but it was never, about me. I was always trying to get out of them what I thought the audience wanted to hear or should want to hear.
I often wonder about your time management, because there you were doing this major radio show in the morning and then also still doing news, television news at night.
And then I'd go home and watch usually CNN and CBC and CTV. I used to say I wasn't much fun for Georgie in those years because I'd work 14 hours a day, and then I'd come home and either, if I had an author on my radio show, I'd read 300 pages a night in order to be prepared. Well, it depended how long the book was, but I would, divvy up the time for 3 nights to read the whole book before they came on the show. So I pretty much worked constantly, but I loved the work, so it didn't seem like work. It's what I did. It's what I loved to do. I didn't play golf. I didn't play tennis. I did radio and television. I used to say it's all indoors. There's no heavy lifting, and the money's pretty good. So I thought I had the world by the tail.
And you wouldn't have done any of that differently?
Not a bit. When I was at CBC, I got a call. I was on holidays on Denman Island with John and Nancy Allen and their mother Jean, who had a place on Denman Island. And she came up to me and she said, "A fellow named Bremner called. He wanted to talk to you." I told him, you were on holidays and you weren't going to be taking phone calls while you're on holidays. I said, you said what? And I looked at Georgia. I said, well, Gene either just cost me $100,000 or made me another $100,000, but it'll be interesting to see how Ron took that. Well, he took it well. He thought it was very funny, and we ended up negotiating a pretty good contract, and I went to NW.
And the Olympics were an important memory for you.
Oh, yeah, and that was an amazing time in our lives. And Lloyd Robertson put it really well. He says, you know, all these people came. Nobody told them to come. They just came. And Vancouver, for that period of time, was an absolutely amazing experience. A very invigorating, it was fun. It was exciting. It was a time of our lives. But people have said, should we do it again? And I go, no, you can't make that happen again. It was a once in a lifetime experience. I don't think you could ever replicate it.
One thing I don't see being replicated is talk radio having the same kind of power. To me, we've lost all of that.
Well, corporate ownership took over radio, and they didn't want to pay the money to attract the talent or the people to, you know, that could command the audience. I am sorry to, you know, for people who are doing it. I try to listen. I never listen for more than 10 or 15 minutes. It's just not compelling. It doesn't make you sit in the car and wait until it's over, you know. I mean,
let's talk about the transition, because you were really at the center of politics and public affairs and public policy, radio and television, and then you started to step away. How difficult was that transition?
I think I was very lucky. I was able to transition out of my career. I think I was 65 when I left CTV, left television, but I got to continue doing talk radio for another 5-6 years. So I was pushing 70 when I left radio, and then I got the opportunity to still do a minute editorial every day on News 1130 for 6 years. You know, so I was able to go from 14 hours a day to 8 hours a day to an hour a day to now.
Is there a little piece of you that really misses not being in the middle of the action?
When something happens that I really feel I would like to speak out on, but most days not. Most days I'm pretty content and enjoying life as it is today.
If you were given advice to a young wannabe broadcaster coming up, what would you say?
Do your homework. Try and land at a radio or television station that you have some confidence in the ownership and the management, that it'll be there in 3 or 4 years. Much harder to do today than it was 25, 30 years ago. Still a wonderful life, if you can do it.
Well, thank you for everything you did do. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bill Good, a BC legend.